Hello, fellow humans, human fellas. Welcome back to my channel. If you enjoyed my last video where I complained about writing decisions made when I was in elementary school, bad news for you hapless fuckers. Today you're stuck with my actual analysis about a game that I first played after learning long division. It is my probably pretentious belief that most popular video game criticism on this platform is rooted in discussing game mechanics, graphics, etc., rather than being concerned with the overall meaning or thematic message of a work. It is now my solemn duty as asshole that once took an English class to try and fill that niche. As you can tell from my slightly fancier intro, I am now smart. Today's video essay is concerning Dragon Age Inquisition, my personal favorite BioWare game. I will be exploring one of the major themes of Inquisition, a discussion on the nature of political and religious institutions, and how said institutions are affected by reform and tradition. You may ask, why do the opinions of a guy that studies rocks for fun about a 4-year-old game matter? Well, they don't. But I have too much time on my hands, a functioning smartphone, and an inflated opinion of my writing abilities, so strap in. Dragon Age Inquisition is an absolutely massive game, and commentary on cultural institutions is far from the only major theme of the work. To narrow my focus, I'm going to start by listing the questions that I will be discussing in regards to this theme. Number 1. What are the major institutions on which the game comments? 2. How do individuals relate to these institutions? 3. What distinguishes a failed institution from a beneficial institution? 4. What allows an institution to maintain itself and at what cost? And finally, 5. What is asserted ultimately about real-world institutions? In this section, I seek to answer the first two questions I put forward. One can probably name several hundred examples of an institution within the Inquisition, but for the purposes of this essay, I will be focusing on the institutions that are the subject of or are deeply affected by quests or choices within the narrative. Given that criteria, I will be discussing the Chantry, the Templars, the Circle, the Orlesian Empire, the Grey Wardens, and shocker, the Inquisition. Every BioWare game relies on its cast of companion and other secondary characters as part of communicating the narrative and major themes of the work. In Inquisition, the experiences of the companion and advisor characters are the first lens through which the player can view the in-game institutions. Nearly every major character in the game is in part characterized by their relationship to one or more in-game institutions. In fact, there's so much that can be said in regard to any one character that for this section I'm really forced to gloss over the finer detail, and I really can't cover every character. Start with, Cassandra struggles with the failings of both the Seekers and the Chantry. However, she still sees both as a force for good and wishes to change them. She does not believe this change can come from within, and seeks to be a reformer from the outside. Cassandra believes that when an institution is dedicated to a good purpose, it will be good. Her personal quest forces her to confront the darkest secrets of the Seekers, and if convinced to rebuild the Seekers, she concludes that secrecy within an organization breeds corruption. Liliana also struggles deeply with the Chantry and her faith. She feels a crisis in the Chantry that she has served for much of her life as it fails to be a force for good when it is most needed. Unlike Cassandra, Liliana is a radical. She asserts that institutions intended to restrict, like the Circle of Magi, ought to be dismantled. If chosen to be divine, she uses that influence to make massive reforms. Cullen has suffered due to the dogma of the Templar Order, and by extension of the Chantry. His experiences have led him to leave the Order and join the Inquisition. This is in part to end the Mage and Templar conflict, but also to reform the institutions themselves. Cullen's experiences with the failure and evil of institutions have led him to be distrustful, hence his rather casual attitude about allowing an assassination to take place, born out of this frustration with the politics of Orlais. He can be seen as both rejectionist and a reformer to some extent. Josephine is a moderate, and views nearly all in-game institutions with some degree of positivity. Evidenced by her personal quest, she seeks to change only within the bounds of the system. This is compounded by her discussion of accidentally killing a man while living as an Orlesian bard. She feels incredible guilt over actions enabled and encouraged by the nature of the game in the Orlesian Empire, but she doesn't condemn the system. Vivienne is a staunch traditionalist. Vivienne, through incredible skill with people and politicking, has risen to a place of significant power and influence despite the extreme discrimination faced by mages. However, contrary to what a player would initially expect, Vivienne fully supports the Circle of Magi in its form right before the rebellion. For Vivienne, tradition is equated with order, and order is equated with good. Consequently, change or critique of tradition is thus chaos, and therefore evil. Finally, Sarah is purely rejectionist. She feels ostracized from all institutions, indeed all of society. Similar to Cullen, she has suffered due to dogmatic institutions, and now views all people that hold power with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Sarah is the clearest example of rejectionism. In general, her skepticism of power is shown favorably, but to be overly simplistic. Now, I wish I could fully discuss every character in this context, but I feel like these examples are sufficient to highlight how the relationships between each individual and the institutions of Thedas are central to their characterization. As stated previously, the relationships between supporting characters and the player are central to discussion of the themes of the narrative. Consequently, these two aspects of Inquisition working in tandem place institutions and their respective shortcomings as central to understanding Dragon Age Inquisition. What is it that separates failed institutions from the successful? To quote the Iron Bull, biggest problem for the institution right now isn't on the front lines, it's at the top. You've got no leader, no inquisitor. Bull goes on to say that the Qunari select their leaders based on those that can make the hard choices and live with the consequences. It is made clear through both main quest and supplemental dialogue that the advisors are unable to reach consensus on major issues facing the Inquisition. As we know, this burden of leadership eventually will fall to the player. The first major decision made by the player is whether to ally with the remaining rebel mages or the now independent Templar Order. I consider this choice itself to be largely an area where BioWare wanted to have a major narrative choice for the player that feels impactful, while still allowing for writing around this choice later in the epilogue for the purposes of the sequel. In terms of analysis on institutional commentary, the choice is excellent to force a player to examine exactly why the Inquisitor favors one institution over another, particularly on multiple playthroughs. Perhaps an Elven Inquisitor is so averse to Tevinter involvement that they would choose to ally with the Templar Order in spite of wanting to support free mages. Or perhaps they seek to borrow on the respect that is held by the Templars, whereas viewing the mages with some suspicion that would carry over to the Inquisition. Regardless of the motivations, I contend that both quests serve as commentary on the nature of institutions. I'll begin with the more popular choice, seeking aid from the mages. After being taken forward in time, it becomes clear that the Inquisition has failed and the world has fallen to Corypheus. However, it wasn't immediate. The Inquisition was not broken at Redcliffe. Prior to warping forward, the Inquisition has routed the Venatori in Redcliffe Castle, and they've cornered Alexius. As we know, once we return to our timeline, the forces of Ferelden, led by either Queen Honora or Alistair or both, are merely minutes away. The Inquisition is not able to recover from this defeat. Unable to seal the breach or make alliances, Thedas is doomed. BioWare makes its case. Without effective leadership, even well-intentioned organizations will fail to succeed. Those you save from the dungeons of Redcliffe know this. They face certain death knowing that they need not only your mark but your guidance to succeed. The message is consistent but told differently when pursuing the aid of the Templars. In all honesty, this quest may be my favorite just because of how blatantly they throw the game's theme at you and make my job really easy. First, you must rank your priorities between the institution of the Templars themselves, the Andraste, and the people that they're sworn to protect. And if I had to choose three main issues the game is concerned with, it would happen to be faith, institutions, and the effects on ordinary people. And then, in case you missed that one, you are shown the Inquisition failing when led by a demon of envy and are able to save the institution literally guided by a spirit of compassion. This is simply another angle by which we can consider BioWare's assertion about the necessity of effective leadership, in this case, contending that an effective leader is motivated by the desire to aid others and not for personal gain. Where this is elevated is when we consider the failings of the leadership of both the mages and the Templars. It is shown that the Lord Seeker and Fiona failed as leaders to follow the lesson taught by the quests, respectively. Fiona did indeed make the difficult decision to indenture herself to Tevinter, but in doing so failed to act with compassion towards the people she was meant to protect. Conversely, Lord Seeker Lucius was willing to allow an envy demon to replace him, failing to lead the Templar Order in a period of great strife. He was absent. The choice whether or not to act punitively towards your chosen faction is somewhat similar to the initial choice of which faction you choose, in that it feels rather impactful but can be written around in the sequel. Of course, I could be totally wrong and look like a total tool when Dragon Age 4 comes out. The impact of each choice is difficult to gauge within the narrative it has made, at least in Bioware series. In general, these choices mostly impact the much more important choice of Divine, so it's pretty obvious that anything Vivian likes you probably shouldn't. As the first act closes with arrival at Skyhold, the appointment of the player as Inquisitor reflects that the Inquisition and its advisors have learned from their experiences with either the Mages or the Templars. Not only have you discovered Incryphius' invasion plan to literally have gained knowledge, the Inquisition finally selected a capable leader, reflecting the themes of the quests. Although the breach has been closed, the mission of the Inquisition remains incomplete. It's now clear that the Inquisition will affect the world much more than expected. It's in this section of the narrative that Bioware comments more meaningfully on the nature of political and religious institutions. I consider the second act of Inquisition to consist chiefly of the quests Here Lie the Abyss and Wicked Eyes, Wicked Hearts. It is these quests that I will be examining to try and determine what Bioware asserts about how institutions are able to maintain the power they wield, as well as the consequences. For the Wardens, the first part of this question is easy. The Grey Wardens maintain power because they are a necessity to Thedas, at least for the foreseeable future. For life to continue as it does, the Grey Wardens exist in their current form with the ability to operate without much scrutiny, and this is largely uncontroversial in Thedas. As we discover in Here Lies the Abyss, this has severe consequences. Similarly to the Seekers, Bioware asserts here that organizations shrouded in secrecy are highly susceptible to corruption. I contend that Bioware has set the Seekers as a foil to the Grey Wardens, using the juxtaposition to highlight how even necessary, well-intentioned organizations can be fallible. The stark differences in portrayal can be easily noticed when we consider how their leaders are shown to us of each organization. The Lord Seeker is clearly painted as a villain. His failings are the source of the corruption within the Seekers and the Templars. Conversely, Warden Commander Clarel is portrayed sympathetically. It is her dedication to the fulfillment of her duty at any cost that allows her to be manipulated. For the Wardens, the corruption is exterior to the organization. It cannot be reasonably argued that defeating the Blight is unnecessary, nor can it be honestly argued that fighting the Blight can be done with making no hard choices. It is through this understanding that the nations of Thedas have sought not to regulate the Wardens. Therefore, I believe Bioware argues that a lack of regulation, even for an essential institution, will lead only to corruption and ought to be rectified. However, as Clarel minds the Inquisitor, the Wardens are standing alone against the Blight. I also believe that Bioware argues that these necessary institutions should not be the only solution to major threats left as lone actors. When one feels as though they are alone in an important calling, they may resort to any means to achieve it. Often, I find that stories in video games fail to take full advantage of gameplay to enhance the narrative. If the story isn't improved by being told in the format of a game, why would you tell it this way? On a whole, I believe that Bioware games adhere to this principle, and nowhere is it done better than Wicked Eyes, Wicked Hearts. I have to admit my bias here, this is easily my favorite quest in the entire series. By actively tracking court approval and its decay, it feels as integral to your gameplay as character health and death. The pressure of the politics of Orlais is felt keenly by the player, an aspect that aids in further developing the discussion on institutions. It is through the synthesis of narrative and gameplay that Bioware dissects how the Orlesian Empire maintains its power. Firstly, we see that the politics of the Empire are extremely insular. The Inquisitor is only able to be brought into this ball as a tool of Gaspard. He decries the game of the Empire, but understands that he must play it if he is to become Emperor. The player is made to be fully aware that one cannot affect change in the Empire without participating in its political structure. Furthermore, the narrative is framed to highlight the difficulty that marginalized groups face in participating in an insular political institution. This understanding is first established with a penalty to court approval to mages and non-humans. This is expanded upon with miscellaneous dialogue from nobles ranging from microaggressions, where Elven Inquisitor is misidentified as a servant, to even blatant racial slurs. For human nobles, this struggle is still made clear with the discrimination to Elven servants and dialogue with Briala. What, then, can we conclude about how the Empire maintains its power? Ultimately, the Orlesian Empire is able to maintain its control by limiting access to power to only those capable of participating in the game. By its nature, the game excludes those who do not have wealth, and it brings barriers up against those who are without privilege. Consequently, those who are able to participate in the game have no inclination to limit their own access to this power, and the status quo is maintained. It is only by the intervention of an outsider, the Inquisitor, that the structure is changed or affected. However, we must still consider what BioWare wishes to comment on about such a structure. Through dialogue with companions and advisors, we can see their opinions on the political game of Orlais. What is most odd is how Leliana, typically a radical, enjoys the game. This power structure is deeply oppressive to mages and non-humans, but Leliana, an Orlesian, fails to condemn the game how she condemns the Chantry, or the Circle. Furthermore, as we explore the Winter Palace, we find that all major players of the evening, Celine, Briala, Gaspard, and the Grand Duchess, have engaged in corrupt behavior to at least some degree. The conclusion being that such exclusionary institutions are not only inherently unjust, that they are also, by nature, hotbeds for corruption. Though central to deepening the lore surrounding the elves and to bringing familiar faces to the series, the final act of the game has comparatively less to say on the topic of institutions. However, the epilogue of the main game, as well as the epilogue to Trespasser, left some final discussion on the nature of institutions. With the election of the Divine, the player is invited to assert their own views on the nature of the World Institution. As stated, Leliana, Cassandra, and Vivian are radical, reform, and traditionalist, respectively. In allowing this important decision to be effected, the BioWare uses the narrative of institution to call the player to consider the role of justice and institutions within Thedas, as well as the real world. The epilogue avoids making major claims out of player choices, but there is some thematic commentary that can be gleaned from it. When Leliana is chosen to be divine, there is obvious conflict within the Chantry. Many players use this chaos as justification for selecting a less controversial choice, but one ought to consider if that is the just choice. Is order and peace good if it requires groups to be marginalized? This is more complicated when discussing the Circle, as in the universe magic truly is quite dangerous. However, the Trespasser epilogue clearly states strife as a result of the priesthood being opened to men and non-humans, which is obviously just. Ultimately, the question of radicalism, reform, and traditionalism is left to the player, but I believe BioWare is highly critical of traditionalist characters. The final choice of the game is whether the Inquisition ought to be disbanded. Other powers, threatened by the influence of the Inquisition, seek some way to contain it. Early in the main game, Mother Giselle praises the original Inquisition on being able to lay down its arms when its purpose is fulfilled. Thematically, the game discusses the flaws and failures of institutions, and the player must make a decision. This is the final question posed by BioWare. In light of all you learned, how do you choose to reject institutions personally, or with the looming threat of Solus, choose to reform the Inquisition so that some of its strengths may be preserved in spite of the risk? There are no moral judgments made by the end of the game, though perhaps Dragon Age 4 will have a final verdict. Ultimately, Dragon Age Inquisition has quite a lot to say on the nature of institutions. Much of the commentary that BioWare makes on the political and religious organizations of Thedas has clear real-world parallels. Therefore, I contend that beyond commenting on the nature and failures of institutions, Inquisition uses narrative choices to invite players to consider their own viewpoints in respect to these institutions, and acts as a lens through which those players that are unfamiliar with the injustice of the real world may view such issues. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked this video. If you enjoy this type of analytical content, please let me know in the comments what other games you'd like me to talk about.